Welcome to the Truth of a Comfort Show. Today's returning guest is the legendary Scott Horton, and I thought we'd do something a little bit different today, as he's done many interviews recently, obviously, with what's going on in Israel and Palestine, which we will get to, but so he doesn't repeat himself, and you've probably heard it before. It would be interesting to talk about this in the context of US foreign policy, the effect this has had on Muslims throughout the war on terror, the radicalisation of them because of it, and the genuine kind of empowerment of terrorists through things like the Iraq War, but also directly in Syria. And then obviously Israel's role in this and kind of coming to today. But thank you for being here again today, Scott. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you again for having me.
So I thought it would be good to start in Syria, a bit ahead maybe of the story of obviously the Mujahideen and things like that. But Syria is a story that many people don't obviously know about and understand. And I thought it was interesting in the context of what's going on in Israel and Palestine and Hamas, because obviously Israel's described Hamas as ISIS, like ISIS. But in Syria, the US, its allies in Israel, were quite happy to empower Al-Nursra, Al-Qaeda, and ISIS for political goals. And you even heard Israeli officials directly say they preferred these groups like ISIS and Al-Nusra to Syria and Iran, which was obviously a very interesting thing to say. I'll put that in the show notes and everything. But could you tell people about the story in Syria? And obviously you could, briefly mention Libya. Again, these groups were empowered in Libya. But yeah, if you could just lay out that story for people, because I think it's one people just really don't know, including myself, until you start reading about it. And it almost sounds crazy. And I know you mentioned many times, it sounds like a crazy conspiracy theory, but it's right there out in the open.
Yeah. All right. Well, look, it's a complicated mess, but I'll take you through it. It's kind of hard to decide how far back to go to get you on the backstory here. But I guess we could say, I'll sum it up like this. And everybody read the book Treacherous Alliance by Trita Parsi if you want to overdose on this kind of information. It's just best, absolutely fantastic. Essentially, the Iranian Revolution in 1979 was when the Shiites came to power, the supreme Ayatollah Khomeini, and then he died in 89 and was succeeded by the current supreme leader, Khamenei. And Israel, after the revolution, kept their relationship with Iran. They weren't worried about Shiite fundamentalism. The leadership in Israel at that time hated Saddam Hussein more. And so even though Ronald Reagan was backing Saddam Hussein, Israel was backing Iran. And there was kind of a partnership agreement there with the Americans that you guys back these guys and we'll back those guys. And they would tilt back and forth. And if the Iranians got too far ahead, they would arm Saddam a little more. And if Saddam started getting too far ahead, Israel would increase shipments to Iran. And that was how they played that game throughout the 1980s. That war finally ended in 1989, and then it led pretty quickly to Iraq War I. Now, in Iraq War I, America, with Israeli encouragement, but they weren't behind the whole thing, but it was certainly the Israeli War Party in America was for that war. And with their encouragement, America had just beaten the hell out of Iraq, right? Just bombed their country, their military, almost completely to smithereens. So here Iran had been backed by Israel all these years, and America backed Iraq, but then America blew up Iraq. So from Israel's point of view, now Iraq isn't powerful enough to balance against Iran. And so when Yitzhak Rabin came into power, actually, I'm not sure when when his government was first sworn in. But anyway, in 1993, it was the Yitzhak Rabin government in the first year of Bill Clinton that insisted that America not, which Clinton was, and he had foolishly said this out loud during the campaign, and which was a big mistake. But his plan was to bring Saddam Hussein in from the cold. He had been a loyal sock puppet dictator for, 10 years straight there. We can at least not keep him on permanent probation. We can kind of bring him in. And the Iranians, the mean old Ayatollah had died, and there was a new Ayatollah. and a new president, this guy Rafsanjani, who was corrupt, business interests, and a right-winger in his own ways and whatever, but was at least considered a quote-unquote moderate in that he wanted to reach out to the United States and try to normalize relations. It had been more than 10 years since been 14 years since. Is everything okay here? Did I lose you?
Oh yeah, I'm still there. Sorry, my camera went. Go, carry on.
So it had been a few years since the revolution there. Are we all right, Lewis?
Yeah. Sorry, carry on. Keep talking. It's just sometimes it cuts out, but just keep going. I'll let you know if I'm not. You'll know if I'm not there anymore.
Okay. Rabin had come in, and Rabin had insisted that Bill Clinton not normalize relations with Iraq and Iran, and instead adopt a policy called dual containment. And it was actually coined by a guy named Martin Indyk, who had worked for Yitzhak Shamir, the Israeli prime minister, and had now come in. And he was the founder of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which was a spinoff of WINEP. Of APAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. And it was in a speech at WINEP that Martin Indyk inaugurated this dual containment policy. And in doing so, essentially that became the single overriding most important factor for turning Al-Qaeda against the United States. And Al-Qaeda had been used by America, well, it wasn't Al-Qaeda yet, but it was the Arab Afghan army that America and Saudi Arabia and Pakistan had supported in the war against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s.
We also have a history of kind of moving in and out of Pakistan. I mean, let's remember here, the people we are fighting today, we funded 20 years ago. And we did it because we were locked in this struggle with the Soviet Union. They invaded Afghanistan, and we did not want to see them control Central Asia, and we went to work. And it was President Reagan in partnership with the Congress, led by Democrats, who said, you know what, sounds like a pretty good idea. Let's deal with the ISI and the Pakistani military, and let's go recruit these mujahideen, and let's get some to come from Saudi Arabia and other places, importing their Wahhabi brand of Islam so that we can go beat the Soviet Union. And guess what? They retreated. They lost billions of dollars, and it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's a very strong argument, which is, wasn't a bad investment to end the Soviet Union, but let's be careful what we sow because we will harvest. So we then left Pakistan. We said, okay, fine. You deal with the stingers that we've left all over your country. You deal with the mines that are along the border. And by the way, we don't want to have anything to do with you. In fact, we're sanctioning you. So we stopped dealing with the Pakistani military and with ISI, and we now are making up for a lot of lost time.
It had been fought by the local mujahideen, but it had also been fought by essentially Arab mercenaries and other Muslim mercenaries from around the world who had come to fight there, including the core of the groups that became Al-Qaeda, which was Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and bin Laden's took over what was called the Azam group from a guy named Abdullah Azam, who had been murdered by nobody knows exactly who. But bin Laden took over his group, and then those groups merged. Now, really beginning in the very early 90s, like right after Iraq War I, almost immediately after Iraq War I in 1992, the next year, the Mujahideen all started moving on to Bosnia, to the next war. Well, Bill Clinton took their side there in Bosnia and later in Kosovo and in Chechnya. Now, I think the Democrats probably thought that they were bribing the loyalty of these guys. We use these Muslim extremist mercenaries to go fight holy wars for us here and there. And then the idea is so they'll keep the heat off us. And yet, meanwhile, look at what happened. All through the 1990s, they were attacking us anyway. And the Egyptian Islamic Jihad really started it, and they ended up merging with bin Laden's group anyway. And bin Laden, he was paying the defense bills of Egyptian Islamic Jihad defendants in America beginning in like 92, right? So this was what they called then the bin Laden network before they called it Al-Qaeda. They would just say the bin Laden network. And that was the same groups. Going back to the very beginning of the 90s, they killed Rabbi Kahana in 1990. They attacked Americans at a Radisson in Yemen in 92. They blew up the World Trade Center and almost knocked them both down in 93. They attacked American trainers at a Saudi National Guard base in 95, the Khobar Towers in 96, the Africa embassies in 98, Nicole in 2000. And all along, Bill Clinton thinks he's smart. And somehow he thinks that it's wise to keep using these guys when clearly they are at war against us. And their primary motivation, according to bin Laden and all of his propaganda for years, from the entire 1990s long, was they couldn't stand it that the Americans had combat forces stationed on the Arabian Peninsula. That was the overriding reason. And then along with that, of course, was the bombing of Iraq from those bases, enforcing the blockade and the no-fly zones over Iraq, which killed hundreds of innocent people all through the 1990s. And it was a real horrifying thing on, depending on how you score it, right? If you compare it to the worst war, then no, but still it's a bomb that destroys a house full of people. Is a horror show for them. And that lasted all through the 90s. It was really bad. And along with enforcing the blockade, which did kill hundreds of thousands of people. Now, it's true that the original UN report that said that 500,000 children had died was retracted, and for good reason. It was not true. Like, one of the people on that study had embellished it. But still, they didn't deny it. Madeleine Albright said, we think the price is worth it. And Osama bin Laden cited that over and over. And of course, to him, 500,000 became 600,000. And sometimes he would even say 1 million, because of course he figures the Americans are underestimating the numbers when really they were overestimating them, or not the Americans, but the UN. So he would just embellish up to 1 million even. But it was still 300,000 innocent civilians who had children who had been deprived to death, and more than that, adults. So the excess deaths during that time frame of the 1990s and the blockade. They did deliberately. The avowed policy was to impoverish and starve and hurt the people of Iraq, to make them desperate enough that they would overthrow Saddam for them, which is just completely crazy. They had their chance to overthrow him in 1991, when George Bush encouraged the Shiites to overthrow Saddam Hussein and then stab them in the back and let Saddam Hussein crush them, even while America was occupying the south of the country. Let Saddam Hussein use his helicopters and tanks to crush their uprising, kill 100,000 of them. That was then the excuse to stay, or one of the excuses invoked. And that was the primary reason that Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, and I guess H.W. Bush to some degree, but especially Bill Clinton's Al-Qaeda mercenaries, turned against the United States in all those attacks through the 90s and culminating in September 11th. And that became the excuse to double down on everything, right? And once they got Afghanistan essentially out of the way, we got to get Afghanistan started, and then we can move on to Iraq. And now, what was the whole policy there? And the whole policy there was to thwart Yitzhak Rabin's peace deal. Now, Yitzhak Rabin's peace deal, it was sort of a state minus, they called it. It was not a legit Palestinian state. Some say it was, a cynical thing, but, I don't know about that. But on face value, he had changed the policy, the overall foreign policy of Israel, from the strategy of the periphery, they called it, which had focused on being allies with states like Iran in order to divide powerful Arab states between them. So, right, Saddam Hussein had to have half his forces facing east and half facing west, this kind of thing, instead of everybody facing west toward Israel. And so same thing with like supporting Ethiopia in order to divide against Sudan and to put pressure on them away, and Egypt away from Israel by having to look at their southern flank, or backing Turkey in order to divide Syria, so that Syria's forces have to look north as well as south when they have an alliance, because the Turks have an alliance with Israel. That was the strategy of the periphery, the previous strategy. Yitzhak Rabin wanted to turn that around. He said, no, we want to demonize Iran. I don't know so much Turkey, but we want to demonize Iran and make peace with the Arabs, deal with the Arabs, and as part of that, a Palestinian state for the conquered, helots, basically, of Israel that had been, most of them driven out of their homes in the war of 1947 and 48, driven into the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but then driven into the control of Jordan and Egypt during that time. And in a secret deal the Israelis made with the king of Jordan. The West Bank had belonged to him, but ever since 67, the Israelis had taken it, and they'd taken control of all of those people. And beginning in 1979 at Camp David, The Israelis had promised they would give that territory up and let the Palestinians have their independent state. And they had never really lived up to that. Instead, they invaded Lebanon and tried to crush the PLO, and all this other stuff went down instead through the 1980s. But so here Rabin is saying, no, we want to give them a state on the West Bank and Gaza Strip, a state minus. It wouldn't have a standing army. They'd be, essentially under Israeli control but nothing like the occupation and PA, sock puppetry that we have now with the Palestinian Authority, which is really created by America and Israel rather than by the Palestinian people. They would have something like a sovereign state there. But what happened was a Netanyahu fan killed Yitzhak Rabin, shot him in the back and killed him in 1995. And so the progress at Oslo basically came to a screeching halt. And after that happened, the next Israeli president was Shimon Peres. And one of the first things that he did as part of, I guess, reinforcing this new strategy of making an enemy out of Iran, which they had already been fighting Hezbollah anyway, whilst kind of still keeping relations with Iran open. He went ahead and invaded Lebanon again in what was called Operation Grapes of Wrath. And it was at that time that the lead hijacker, Mohammed Atta, and his friend Ramzi bin al-Shibh, who was one of the major organizers of the September 11th attack, that was what made them decide that they wanted to join the army, proverbially, fill out their last will and testament, and join the war against the United States, was based on that. And on Israel's invasion of Lebanon. And a couple of months later, bin Laden put out his first declaration of war, which went on and on about Israel's operation in Grapes of Wrath. And so they decided, here are these Egyptian engineering students studying in Hamburg, Germany, answer a call to action by a Saudi princeling in exile in Afghanistan, asking them to attack America to take revenge for what Israel is doing in Lebanon. Got that? So, and these are America's mercenaries blowing up in our face here. These are Carter and Reagan's and Clinton's guys who are now attacking us. Well, this is the younger generation, but in fact, some of the hijackers had fought in Bosnia. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was one of the major organizers, had fought in Bosnia. The guy who had recruited Ramzi bin al-Shibh and Mohammed Atta into Al-Qaeda had fought for Clinton in Bosnia. And two of the pilot hijackers from Flight 77 that hit the Pentagon, Midhar and Hamzmi, I always say it wrong, were veterans of Bill Clinton's war in Bosnia too. Anyway, I said I'd do the short version, didn't I? Sorry. So then what happened was...
Can I just jump in? Sorry, can I just because I know why you're speaking about this and the history is important. One of my questions kind of involved this, but just for kind of time purposes, because it can take a long...
I'm getting right to it. I promise, Lewis. So here it goes. So here's the deal. The Israeli strategy for exploiting September 11th was to get America to invade Iraq. And so here was this policy that had been brought on by America's policies that had been insisted upon by Israel and Israeli actions themselves. And their first reaction is, this is good. That's what Benjamin Netanyahu told the New York Times the next day. They interviewed him, and he said, this is very good. That's not like some hearsay report. That was what he told the New York Times. Oh, not very good, but, pretty good. It'll help generate support for us and sympathy with our position, blah, blah, blah. And then what'd he do? The neoconservatives, as America knows them, as Americans now know them, this small, weird sect of conservative Republicans that nobody really knew who they were before, they took us to war. Well, who were they? They were Netanyahu's guys. And they had a strategy. And the strategy was that if America would knock off Saddam Hussein, that would make Jordan and Turkey dominant in Iraq. And then it's complicated, but they had this theory that the Shiites of Iraq just love being told what to do. And their first plan was, we'll have a Hashemite cousin of the king of Jordan tell them what to do, which is completely crazy. They're Sunnis, and the Shiites aren't going to follow them. Wormser and them believe, Pearl, that the blood of the prophet in the veins of the Hashemites would somehow command the allegiance of the Shiites. This is crazy. They eventually abandoned that plan for having a loyal American sock puppet, Ahmed Chalabi, take charge, which they ended up abandoning because it was so nonsensical. And the whole time, this never worked. But anyway, their idea was that the newly compliant Iraqi Shiite clergy in Najaf would command Hezbollah in southern Lebanon to stop being friends with Syria and Iran, because this is the Shiite axis of power against America and Israel over there. America's alliance system is the Israelis, along with the Turks, who are not Arabs but are Sunnis, and the rest of the Sunni Arab states, right? Kuwait and the whole GCC, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, which is a majority Shiite population, was ruled by a Sunni king, the UAE, Oman, and before Yemen. That's complicated now. But anyway, these are our guys. Saddam Hussein used to be our guy, but America stabbed him in the back rather than the other way around, really. But so the idea was that once we have, because Saddam Hussein, he might be a Sunni, but he's not compliant with our wishes, and he doesn't have the blood of the prophet in his veins, or whatever, pot they were smoking, to think that this was going to work. And so what happened in reality, of course, was that when they launched, to emphasize their motive here, this is all in the clean break strategy. And the idea was, if America has their new loyal Shiite clergy, or Israel has their new loyal Shiite clergy in Iraq, tell Hezbollah to stop being friends with Syria and Iran and stop accepting their weapons, then Hezbollah will be neutralized as a threat to Israel on their northern front. As we can see right now, it's very important. What's Hezbollah going to do on the northern front as all this is going on in especially Gaza, but also in the West Bank, right? So they're saying, if we could take that pressure off, where now we don't have to worry about Hezbollah on the northern flank anymore, then that makes it easier for us to abandon the Oslo deal and the pressure by the international community to give the Palestinians their own state. We can deny them their state, and we won't have to worry so much about the Shiites coming to pressure us, or intervene. So that was kind of the whole completely crazy theory behind the neoconservative push to get America to invade Iraq for them in 2003. And then what happened? The Shiites took over the place. And are they loyal to America and Turkey and Jordan? No. It was Iran's best friends that inherited the place. George W. Bush fought that whole war for the other side. Not our enemies, really, but in terms of the local alliance system, the other side, the Shiite side. He put Baghdad on Iran's side of the ledger, joining Damascus and Hezbollah in southern Lebanon as what they call the Shiite crescent of power. It was the king of Jordan who coined that phrase, ironically. Once America invaded Iraq, he says, oh, see, you've created the Shiite crescent. So now, whereas before Saddam Hussein was the roadblock, Sunni Saddam was sitting in the middle between Iran and Syria and Lebanon. Now he's gone. And now the Shiites rule Iraq. And America has completed the arc, the arch of power, right? The is what I meant to say. And this is, in fact, Wormser in the Clean Break in Coping with Crumbling States papers. He says Syria is the keystone of the arch. It's the whole deal. This is where Iran sends their weapons through Syria to Hezbollah. Now they have an even easier time of that with loyal Shiites, or at least friendly Shiites, in power in Baghdad. So then what's America do? It's not under Obama. Well, it is, but first it's under Bush. And I will beg your audience, like I'll give everybody 75 cents if you will just go and, PayPal me. I'll hit you up. Just strike that. You know what I mean? Go and read The Redirection by Seymour Hersh from 2007. What happens is Elliot Abrams and Zalmay Khalilzad and a couple of the other neoconservatives tell Bush, listen, man, we really screwed up. We're fighting this whole war for the Shiites. The Israelis are freaking out. The Saudis are really upset. And you can read in the WikiLeaks where Zalmay Khalilzad goes and talks to the king in January of 2006. And the king says, it was always us and you guys and Saddam against Iran. Now you have given Iraq to Iran on a golden platter. And Khalilzad says, oh, I'm so sorry, Your Highness. We're going to make it up to you. So it's not just Israel here. There's all these countries have their interests. And so And that was certainly part of it. So they launched this redirection, and they started backing bin Ladenite groups in Libya, the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria. Liz Cheney was a big part of this, creating the Syrian National Council as part of the State Department at that time under W. Bush, and bringing the Muslim Brotherhood groups in. Like, this was their risk, was we're going to try to bring these Muslim Brotherhood groups in and see how moderate they could be. Well, Syrian Muslim Brotherhood are pretty Al-Qaeda terrorists-like. They sit in the parliament in Qatar. I don't know. They had renounced violence in Egypt. But in Syria, yeah, they're throat-cutting loonies still, I guess. And that was the people that Liz Cheney had hired. And they backed this group called Jandala, who are horrible suicide bomber, head chopper maniacs in Iran as well. So that was the policy that Obama inherited. So when you and your family were sitting around the dinner table saying, it's so weird that America's backing bin Ladenite suicide bombers in Syria right now, Dad, what do you think's behind that? The answer was the redirection, son. Barack Obama is picking up where George Bush left off. And he's making up for George Bush's massive blunder in Iraq War II, which W. Bush wouldn't call it that way, but that was what he was doing. That was what redirection means. Oops, we better try to turn this thing around somehow. So what they do, they put Iran up 2 pegs in Iraq. So now it fell on Obama to try to take Iran down at least 1 peg in Syria. And so, yes, as you said in your question, Obama backed Al-Qaeda suicide bombers. Al-Nursra is Al-Qaeda. I dreamed about this, I think last night or maybe the night before last. Everyone could look it up. It's Victoria Nuland, of all people, Robert Kagan's wife, the lady who got us into so much trouble in Ukraine and all over the place. She was the press secretary for the State Department at the time. And you can go and find it at state.gov, December 2012. Jabhat al-Nusra is just an alias for Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That is the vanguard of the Sunni insurgency that resisted America and Shiite power in the civil war in Iraq War II. Zarqawi's head chopper, suicide bomber, berserker maniacs, who the local Sunni population had killed off for us, by the way, and had chased right out of the country, by the way. It wasn't David Petraeus in the surge that beat Al-Qaeda. It was the awakening, and that wasn't even because of American money. Even that was getting out ahead of the parade. Local Sunnis didn't want to live like Saudis in Iraq. Local Sunnis told these bin Ladenites, beat it or you're going to get shot, and they did. And so they had been welcome for a while and had been more harm than good for the Sunni insurgency anyway, and wore out their welcome very quickly. And it was a miracle. Honestly, man, George W. Bush turned all of Western Iraq into jihadi university for 5 years. And then the locals started murdering the hell out of them to death. It was like, man, you could have never asked for a magic wish to come true like that. How is this horrible, horrible error ever going to be corrected? Local Sunnis in Iraq and Western Iraq are like, you know what? We'll kill them for you. In fact, we'll just kill them for us, and got rid of them. But then what happened? Barack Obama comes with the defibrillator, billions of dollars, and brings them right back to life in alliance with Israel, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, a little bit Kuwait, although I don't know. But mostly Qatar and UAE some too. But especially, Qatar and Turkey are very in tight with the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Saudis have a kind of bifurcated relationship with them. They hate them in most places, but back them in Yemen, for example. And they ended up being all different kinds of groups fighting in the jihad there. But the most important thing for the distinction to understand the story for us here is they were the Sunnis. And look here. It wasn't Hezbollah, the Shiites, who knocked our towers down. That was bin Laden who did that. And it wasn't the Shiites that killed 4,000 of our guys in Iraq War II. Although they did kill about 500 of them, but that was all Petraeus' fault for picking that fight 100% with Sadr. But still, the 4,000 of the 4,500 Americans who died in Iraq War II died fighting the Sunni insurgency. And Al-Qaeda was the vanguard of that, the worst of the suicide bombers. on the Sunni insurgency side, AQI, which if you remember that war, you're probably too young. But if people remember that war, our government pretended that the entire Sunni insurgency were these guys because they were so horrible that they discredited the entire movement. You know, it was the same kind of thing in Syria where
when you say, obviously just for the audience, when you say Obama, the US, its allies pumped all this money into groups like Al-Nursra and terrorist groups, do you mean it as we pumped lots of arms and money into the FSA and the moderates, and then Al-Nursra and the other groups were stronger, so they took the arms, or was it an actual policy, or did it vary, obviously, depending on the country? Did we directly, purposely back them, or is it we're going to back these groups? We know the arms are going to fall into these groups, and they're the stronger groups. And you know, everyone knew Al-Nursra and the others were the fighting force taking more territory. So was it direct, as in we actually armed, or we armed them through our Gulf allies, or was it indirect, plausible deniability? You know, where do you make the distinction?
Yes, that is all exactly correct, right? I mean, and it also depends on which all countries you're talking about and which year of the thing and this and that. But yes, there's a lot of deniability in there, a lot of, no, I swear we're only backing mythical moderates, but then somehow all the money and weapons are going to the extremists. But it's also the case, especially in the situation regarding Turkey and Saudi, where they're just paying directly to ISIS, and nobody's even pretending they're not. And this is even after ISIS has broken off from Nusra. And that just essentially means the Iraqi-dominated faction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria broke away from the Syrian-dominated faction of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Syria and declared that we want to have our caliphate now. And first they conquered all of eastern Syria, including Raqqa, in 2013, and then a year later they rolled right in June of 14. They rolled right in and conquered all of western Iraq, and that was how the caliphate was created. And in that situation, you know what, like, I really don't know, and I have no need to reach out like over past my skis here. Like, I don't think it's necessary, and I don't have any actual evidence or strong indication that Obama's CIA was telling Saudi, yes, more money for ISIS, please, right? Like, I don't know that that's right, but it's kind of completely beside the point, right? Essentially, you know what? I'll tell you something. I learned a little wisdom this year from a guy who I interviewed in my big special that I did about the Waco massacre 30 years ago. The guy's name is David Hardy, and he wrote the best book about Waco. And it's called This Is Not an Assault. And he had been a former federal cop in the Interior Department. So he had a little bit of understanding about how these federal cops think that really helped contribute to his ability to explain the Waco situation in his books, part of why he did such a great job. But one of the things that he said to me was, you have to understand in these government bureaucracies, and this rang really true to me, I immediately thought of Syria when he said this, okay? He says, in a government bureaucracy, there's the truth, there's falsity, and then there's our position. And our position, he says, exists on an entirely separate plane of reality from truth and falsity. They have nothing to do with it. Our position is the thing we all agreed on when we were in a room and decided to think and do a thing. And whatever incentives are involved in that, money, office politics, and position, and jockeying for power and attention, and all the things that go, you know, along with all that, future opportunities that are going to come. All those reasons aside, our position is our position. And now it's not just written on paper. Now it's engraved in granite. And now that's it. And so, for example, if everyone in the room says, yeah, you know what we're going to do, Billy, is we're going to back the mythical moderates and it's going to be great. And then Billy goes, yeah, that's right, Sally. Those moderates sure are moderate and they're going to stop all the bad guys on all sides for us if we only help them enough. And then Jill goes, yeah, and then I can get a promotion to UN ambassador. And everybody goes, yeah, this is great. Then that's how war gets started, right? And then meanwhile, you and me and everybody reading antiwar.com every day is going, wait a minute. These mythical moderates are just giving all the money and all the weapons to the suicide bombers who don't mind fighting, don't mind dying, and are going out there and leading the thing. You act like a bunch of citizen militias are going to rise up like the American Revolution and are, you know, all the finest gentlemen in Aleppo are going to rise up and lead this revolution. Well, that's not right. It's a bunch of bin Ladenite head chopper lunatics. There was a kid in, it could have been 13. I think it was in 2012 where a guy said, hey, kid, give me a discount on this fruit. Like, charge me price for this orange. And the kid said to him, hey, listen, pal, if you were Muhammad himself, I got to charge you full price for the orange, you know? And an Al-Nursra guy said, what did you say? And shot the kid in the face and killed him. Right? That was who these guys were. They were insane, lunatic, suicide bomber, bin Ladenite terrorist murderers. But our position says, well, yeah, that's why we got to back the moderates more, because the more power the moderates have, the more they'll marginalize extremists like that, and they'll be able to take on all the extremists on the Sunni side, as well as Assad and his Alawite-led, primarily Sunni, by the way, army, and their Shiite friends, as well as Hezbollah, who had come from Lebanon to help fight, as well as Iran, who had sent their IRGC officers to come and train and coordinate the war on the ground. And you can see how this is just nuts. It's just nuts. But if anybody says to them, yeah, but look, you're just backing the bad guys, they go, no, we're backing the mythical moderates. And they stuck with that line, you know, and look, they know they're lying. I'm not making excuses for them. I'm just saying they get married to our position in a way where they just can't abandon it. We see the same thing over and over. It's the same thing with Iraq War II, where Iraq War II was supposed to be wonderful. And then it went completely to hell. And everybody who had supported it said, oh, yeah, no, we meant to do that. See, it's the flypaper theory. We're trying to draw terrorists to Iraq so we can kill them there. But it's like, dude, you're generating new terrorists by the thousands. Don't give me that crap. But what were they going to do? Admit that they were wrong? No, they come up with new excuses. They come up with a reason why what they did wasn't wrong. There's, you know, some kind of credibility to be found, or some redemption to be found in their policy. And in fact, then look at the end of the Syrian war. So it grew up into the caliphate. And Obama then, what did he do, by the way? The caliphate, they seized Mosul and most of Western Iraq in June of 14. And what did Obama do? He sat around for 8 weeks telling the Shiites, beg me, come on, and refusing to come to their aid. Not that I'm for intervention. I opposed it at the time, but that's not the question. The question is, what was Obama doing? He was letting these bin Ladenites absolutely hammer the crap out of the Shiites that we had fought Iraq War II for, including massacring their military cadets, 1,700 Air Force cadets massacred at Camp Speicher, and just these horrific massacres of civilians all over the place. Then Obama came in, he launched Iraq War III in the summer of 14 to destroy the caliphate that he had built to spike the Shiites that Bush had fought Iraq War II for and wished he hadn't. Now, what's Obama doing? Fighting another war for those same Shiites again. Because, oops, this bin Ladenite caliphate is a bridge too far. This guy Baghdadi up there on the balcony at the Great Mosque in Mosul, like a cross between bin Laden and Mussolini, declaring himself the dictator. This is never going to fly. So they had to, what? I swear this is true. It's documented in my book. I got the quotes. U.S. Air Force literally flying cover for the Iranian IRGC on the ground in the Battle of Tikrit, Saddam Hussein's hometown, to force the Islamic State Caliphate out of there on behalf of the Shiites led by Iran. And so
when you reference the 1,700 airmen there, is that the same, you know, I've learned this through you, obviously, the clip of Michael Oren, the Israeli ambassador to the US, where he's with Jeffrey Goldberg, and he says right after ISIS takes over all this land, it's not at the start of it, ISIS had already taken all this land and did that massacre, where he said they prefer the Sunni evil, as in ISIS, Al-Nursra, all of those kind of guys, rather than the Shia, meaning Iran and kind of, Syria in that. Is that the kind of the reference?
And what I'm going to say is harsh, and perhaps a little edgy. But if we have to choose the lesser of evils here, the lesser evil is the Sunnis over the Shiites. For the reason
You're
I
not
mentioned
speaking
before.
for me.
Okay, it's a lesser evil. It's an evil, believe me, it's a terrible evil. Again, they've just taken out 1,700 former Iraqi soldiers and shot them in a field. But who are they fighting against? They're fighting against the proxy with Iran that's complicit in the murder of 160,000 people in Syria. You can just do the math. And again, one side is armed with suicide bombers and rockets. The other side has access to military nuclear capabilities. So from Israel's perspective, if someone's got, if there's got to be an evil that's going to prevail, let the Sunni evil prevail. And I'm speaking entirely for myself.
Exactly. And thank you for bringing me back to the Israeli role here. It's not central to it, but yeah, sort of, kind of it is. I mean, the neocons, again, they launched Iraq War II for Israel to limit Iranian power and influence over Hezbollah on their northern border so they could get away with stealing the West Bank. And then, so, oops, that only empowered Iran and Hezbollah and Syria. So then, oops, they had to go and launch this horrible war in Syria on behalf of the bin Ladenites in order to limit that damage, which then blew up so big that they ended up having to launch Iraq War III to destroy it again. But during that whole period of support for the bad guys for the Sunni side in Syria, Israel was in on it. And especially later in the game, they said, and I think that this is right. It depends on who you ask. Michael Oren said, we always wanted Assad gone from the beginning of the war. He told that to the Jerusalem Post. And he had been Netanyahu's ambassador to the United States. There were others there was one guy who told Isabel Kirshner at the New York Times that we want both sides to continue to hemorrhage to death. We don't want either side to win. I think they were saying they wanted ultimately for Assad to survive. Better the devil you know. But if we can keep them fighting as long as possible, we're happy with that. But then once the ISIS caliphate broke off, then in 2013, and then even after they conquered all of Western Iraq, numerous Israeli officials said that they liked it that way. They preferred it, and most especially Michael Oren in that clip that you're talking about. And I'll urge your audience to go. All you got to do is go to YouTube and just type in Oren. That's O-R-E-N. Just type in Oren Sunnis, and it comes right up. That's it. That's all you need. Oren Sunnis.
I'll clip it up. I'll put a clip of it literally over this so they can watch it. They don't even need to go there. But still,
and so you see, he disclaims a couple times there. Okay, now that we're back from the clip, he disclaims a couple times, hey, this is just my opinion. But then he also says, from Israel's point of view, because he's clearly speaking for Netanyahu and his government here. And he's saying, we prefer the Sunni evil to the Shiite evil. And as you said, he explicitly references 1,700 Iraqi Air Force cadets being taken out back and shot in the head, massacred. I think these were the ones who were all laid down on the basketball court and just machine gunned to death with AK-47s. Possibly is partial that. And then there's also the guys who were all shot in the head and thrown in the river, one after another by these ISIS guys. I'm not sure if that was the same massacre or not. Anyway, certainly the machine gunning of all the cadets laying down on the basketball court. And Oren explicitly references that. So in other words, he's not saying, well, we like these mythical moderates from the Free Syrian Army. He's not saying that. He's explicitly referencing ISIS at their worst atrocity and saying, yeah, but still, no, that's totally cool because we prefer them to Iran. And then what's his excuses for that? Which, by the way, even Jeffrey Goldberg is like, hey, pal, you're not speaking for me here. But what's his excuse? He says, well, because Iran has military nuclear technology and because Assad is responsible for all the deaths in the war. Well, but both of those things are completely ridiculous, stupid lies. What is he talking about? Everybody knows that Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons. If Iran was making nuclear weapons, they'd have an arsenal by now, since we live deep into the future here. And Benjamin Netanyahu, for one, has been saying they're working on nukes since 1992. And here they still don't have any of this 1945 technology, atom splitting machine here, because they're not trying to make them, because the Ayatollah forbid it. Now, you don't have to trust the Ayatollah, but I'm saying look at the result. They never did make atom bombs, okay? It is what it is. So it's just a lie. And then to blame Assad for every death in the war is completely preposterous. He's putting down a foreign-sponsored insurrection that's mostly being fought by foreign mercenaries anyway. That's an invasion by a bunch of foreign mercenaries. This isn't a revolution. And any such armed insurrection in any Western country would also be crushed with force. We have elections around here, even if you don't have elections around there. They're not letting those people overthrow the government anymore. What do you think Barack Obama would do? A bunch of head-chopping lunatics try to take over D.C. He would send the American Army infantry out there to obliterate them to death with fire until they were all gone, is what he would do. Same for any president, would do the same thing. Hell, look what Coolidge did to the bonus army. I mean, these were America's heroic World War I veterans, and he sent MacArthur and Eisenhower, and they were unarmed. They were unarmed. They were not threatening a violent coup. They were unarmed, camping in Washington, D.C. and across the river saying, we want our World War I pensions now because we're so destitute from the Great Depression. And they weren't even threatening violence. They were just former military men, but they had not brought their rifles. And what did Coolidge do? He sent MacArthur and Eisenhower out there, who gladly fixed bayonets and forced those guys right out of town. And that's in good old USA, pinnacle of global democracy, blah, blah, blah. You heard it before. So anyway, and I collect in the book enough already. I have, I don't know, 10 or a dozen quotes of Israeli officials saying, no, we definitely prefer ISIS to Iran. We definitely prefer the Islamic State to Assad. And which is just, you think about that from an Israeli point of view, how completely crazy that is. Assad and his Syrian Arab army, they're no threat to Israel. This guy, he's not an ideologue. He didn't even want to be the dictator. His older brother died in a car wreck. He was an ophthalmologist in London when he was drafted to be the dictator of the country. And I'm not saying he's not responsible for his actions. He certainly is. And he waged a brutal war to put down that insurrection. But I'm just saying any other government, certainly any Western government would put in the same position, would have done essentially the same thing. I'm not absolving him in any way, but I'm saying it's still all Barack Obama's fault for putting him in that position 100%. And for all the responsibility of Israel, who did provide direct financial, as well as medical support for Al-Nursra fighters during that time, and same for Turkey with all of their financial and weaponry and other support, and Saudi and all of them. Let me tell you something. Barack Obama was the emperor of the world empire. And if he had picked up the phone and told the king of Saudi Arabia and the emir of Qatar and the prime minister of Israel and the president of Turkey, no, I don't give a damn what your priorities are. I'm telling you, USA's priority is keeping Al-Qaeda down, period. That's it. So all of you are just going to have to lump it. Assad stays, shut the hell up. If he had said that, the whole thing would have been over. That'd have been it. The only reason any of this happened was because Barack Obama said, all right, let's do it. Signed a finding authorizing the CIA first to coordinate allied support and then eventually to go all in on training and supporting and the rest. And man, there are side stories to this thing that are beyond belief, right? Like you could make a movie about just this and people would think it was just fiction. That American Army Rangers training Al-Qaeda terrorists in Jordan were all shot and killed by the border guard, who was an ISIS guy or an Al-Nursra guy who had infiltrated the Jordanian security forces or had been a member of their forces who'd been recruited. And so here you have American Army Rangers working for the CIA, training Al-Qaeda terrorists and getting shot in the back to death. Okay? And Barack Obama was not impeached and removed from office for that. Nobody scratched the needle off the record and said, wait, what is happening? What are we doing? How is America on the side of the suicide guys who did the kamikaze attack on our towers? Because what, they're fighting Hezbollah that didn't attack us? Because they're fighting Assad with the three-piece suit and the clean-shaven chin with no religious faith at all? I mean, he's nominally an Alawite, but whatever. It's not like he's some religious fundamentalist wacko of any description, right? I mean, this is crazy. It's completely crazy. And, you know, this is why, by the way, Tulsi Gabbard seemed heroic for a minute there. Because Tulsi Gabbard fought in Iraq War II. Or she didn't really fight pulling triggers, but she was stationed at Balad Air Base north of Baghdad taking incoming shells. So like that counts, man. And it was a medical unit. So you can only imagine the guys screaming for their mama dying in her presence during that time. She went through hell during that time. And 2 years later, 3 years later, Barack Obama is saying, oh, the shirts and the skins have switched sides now. And we're now on the side of the shirts against the skins. And she went, what? This is a woman who broadly supports the war against terrorists, against bin Ladenites, and for that matter, hell, against Hezbollah even. She's for fighting against both sides of the war. But fighting for the bin Ladenites? Because we hate the Shiites more? When we just finished fighting a war for them? Against them? That doesn't make any sense. That's completely loco. And then what do? They castigated her and said, oh, she loves Assad. She's a pro-Assad traitor. Imagine thinking for a minute that this woman from Hawaii has some kind. Imagine allowing yourself to be lied to for a minute. That this woman, who is still to this day an active duty officer in the Hawaiian National Guard, was loyal, a toady, as what's her name said on the Rogan show, of Bashar al-Assad, because she said this policy is insane. Now, Iraq War II, that's wrong, really wrong, and really bad. But Syria, that's treason. That's completely nuts, and it's impossible to justify without absolutely lying your ass off and somehow pretending that Assad was responsible for every death, that Assad had no motive in the world for waking up in the morning other than a plan to exterminate the entire population of his country. And thank goodness America and its allies were helping these plucky rebels defend the population of the country from his genocidal intent. And they're just lying. They're just lying, man. It's completely made up. The whole thing, the whole narrative was made up because the only way to cover for what they were doing, which again was just trying to make up for their mistake of Iraq War II, which was a completely unforced error that they did in an attempt to limit the power of the Shiites here in the first place.
Yeah, and for people who think this still sounds insane, you can hear.
What my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies. Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I've just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis, the Emiratis, etc. What were they doing? They were so determined to take down Assad and essentially have a proxy Sunni-Shia war. What did they do? They poured hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of tons of weapons into anyone who would fight against Assad, except that the people who were being supplied were Al-Nursra and Al-Qaeda and the extremist elements of jihadis coming from other parts of the world. Now you think I'm exaggerating? Take a look. Where did all of this go? So now what's happening? All of a sudden, everybody's awakened because this outfit called ISIL, which was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which when they were essentially thrown out of Iraq, found open space and territory in eastern Syria, worked with Al-Nursra, who we declared a terrorist group early on, and we could not convince our colleagues to stop supplying them.
Let me ask you, Michael. I mean, I think we've been putting an extraordinary amount of arms in, haven't we?
Yeah, and I have to say, as you said, it's a double-edged sword because you give people the ability to defend themselves, but when you pump more weapons into a situation like Syria, it doesn't end well for Syrians because there's always somebody else that's willing to pump more weapons in for the other side. The groups, the armed groups in Syria get a lot of support, not just from the United States, but from other partners. And we've never said that
Qatar, Russia, Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, huge amount of weapons coming in, huge amount of money.
But pumping weapons in causes someone else to pump more weapons in, and you end up with Aleppo.
I mean, the reason Russia came in is because ISIL was getting stronger. Daesh was threatening the possibility of going to Damascus and so forth. And that's why Russia came in, because they didn't want a Daesh government. And they supported Assad. And we know that this was growing. We were watching it. We saw that Daesh was growing in strength. And we thought Assad was threatened. We thought, however, we could probably manage, that Assad might then negotiate. Instead of negotiating, you got Assad. Now you got Putin to support him.
Joe Biden doing his Harvard speech where he's like, all these cries, again, this is in your book, all the cries to the allies, Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, who were just pumping money and arms into any group like Al-Nursra who would take it. You have John Kerry caught on leak tape saying they watched ISIS grow, they thought they could manage it and use it as leverage. You have constant articles throughout, there's just endless articles about from 2012 onwards, Qatar and Saudi Arabia throwing money and arms into the war, the US, the CIA coordinating it in Turkey and Jordan, as you said. And even throughout that period, you had in 2010 Hillary Clinton's emails that came out where it talks about Saudi Arabia, Qatar, all the Gulf nations, always the top funders of terrorism. We didn't go in and invade them like Afghanistan, all these other countries. And the thing is, with the war on terror, it obviously did radicalize people, and the drone war, and empowered these terrorist groups. ISIS came out of it, all these other ones. And then what happens is it ends up putting the Muslim name. Anytime you think of Muslims, people think of Muslims, they start to think terrorism. That guy on the train, he's a Muslim, he's got a backpack, what's going on. And obviously with Israel and Palestine going on at the moment, there's a lot of discussion about anti-Semitism, which obviously we know exists. There are people who do hate the Jews. And we obviously do know Israel use it as a tool when it is being critical about their actions or Zionism. But why does no one care about Islamophobia? Why does no one seem to care about that? Is it because they can only see the image of them through the war on terror? You don't hear anyone doing a protest about Islamophobia. So how do you think the war on terror, obviously I'm in the UK, you're in the US, how has the war on terror affected, just kind of the Muslim population around the world and how they're seen?
Well, yeah, the whole thing is terrible, right? The last thing in the world George W. Bush was going to do was tell the American people the truth. As I said before, these people are angry about our policy, his father's and his predecessors' policy in Arabia, as well as Israeli policy in Palestine and Lebanon with American support, generating all this hatred for us. His father was vice president under Ronald Reagan when they did the bulk of their backing of the creation of these terrorist groups in the 80s in the war in Afghanistan. They could never fess up to that. Think of all of the conflicting incentives that the president had just because he was W. Bush. It's the same problem if he had been Al Gore. He had been the right-hand man of the previous guy the whole time that they had done all these horrible things leading to the attack, right? So it would have been nice if we had just had Brand X random governor from, Colorado or something up there, whoever, some guy who none of this previously was his fault, right? Instead, it was not that Bush wanted to, but it was just impossible that they could tell the truth. So what they do instead? So Mohammed made him do it. In fact, it is radical Islam which doesn't mean anything, right? There's no sect of Islam called radical Islam. I don't even say what they mean by that. Do they mean like fundamentalist Islam? Or they mean Islam mixed with radical politics? Or they mean, hey, can we differentiate even between Shiite fundamentalists and Sunni fundamentalists? And this, that, or the other thing? Nope. You want to get into like some war party blogs and you'll see, oh no, they're talking all about the Wahhabis and the Salafis. Well, what does that mean, right? The Wahhabis say we want literal interpretation. They're both sects of Sunnis, subsects of Sunnis. The Wahhabis say we want literal interpretations of the texts. And the Salafis say we want to live like Muhammad and his people lived way back then. Okay, well, there are some numbers, I think millions of Wahhabis and some significant numbers of Salafis in the world. Very few of them share bin Laden's politics. The vast majority of them are what are called quietists, meaning they obey the parts of the Quran and the Hadiths that say, you shut up and do what your king says. If Allah didn't want him to be the king, he wouldn't be the king, would he? So it's not your business to contradict civil authority. It's your business to get right with God so that you can go to paradise, period. And there are Americans in fundamentalist Christian traditions in America who are the same way. In fact, I don't know about the entire history previously, but I know by and large, American fundamentalist Christians were not that political until, ironically, it was Jimmy Carter who organized them as a political voting bloc to support him. He was the first Southern Baptist born-again Christian to be an American president, I believe. And yeah, because, the other Southerners were not that I can think of. But then, of course, they became Reaganites very quickly. Within 4 years, they all turned to the Reaganites. And then you have the entire phenomenon of all the TV preachers of the 80s and 90s and 2000s, all the Jerry Falwells and John Hagees and Pat Robertsons and Robert Tiltons and all of these, people who really kind of encourage Ralph Reed and the Christian Coalition, all these people who really encouraged born-again Christians to get involved in right-wing Republican politics. They'd never really been like that before. They had always been, look, your purpose here on earth is to see if you can please God enough to get your golden ticket, man. That's what it's all about is, depending on your interpretations of Christian faith, mostly, and what are the qualifications, you've got to get to live forever. Same kind of thing over there. You have extremely, you could call them radical Muslims who don't even have politics, who don't even care about politics, who just accept that they live in a country where whoever the hell is the sultan, because that's how it is. And wouldn't think for a minute that it was their responsibility to change that. And so there are, the bin Ladenites. The reason I call them the bin Ladenites is because, quite frankly, their different religious affiliations and depth of religious, piousness and even, genuineness is widely varied. And what these men share is politics. Look at the vast majority of ISIS fighters in Iraq War III. 4 is the one we're on the verge of now. Don't get ahead of yourself, Horton. In Iraq War III, they had about 100,000, 150,000 fighters on the ground in Iraq under the caliphate. Most of them are just regular Iraqi Sunni fighters. They're not there because they're like insane, committed bin Ladenite international jihadis trying to overthrow the world and all of these things. They're just fighting on the Sunni side against the Shiite side in the local war that's broken out again. That's all George W. Bush's fault. That we just started a few years before. You know what I mean? A decade before. That was what was happening there. They were not a bunch of hardcore Salafi, whatever, this and that, convert or die. Same thing even when you look at the hijackers of September 11. These are all like upper middle class guys, a lot of them with, again, advanced Western educations. And they were, widely reported to have spent a lot of time at strip clubs and drinking and all these kinds of things. They were apparently not so afraid of what God was going to say about 2 days from now when they're done kamikaze their plane into a tower. They were fighting for political reasons. And look, after America was attacked on that day, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions, well, certainly hundreds of thousands of people joined the army, joined the American Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, including Muslims, joined the American service to go and fight. It wasn't because radical Christianity or radical Americanism or whatever. It was just that they felt solidarity with the Americans who'd been killed in New York and Virginia, and they wanted to go and fight back against the bad guys. What did it? So it's the same thing here. I mean, just because the states of Arabia are not United States, still, here's Lebanese and Yemenis and mostly Saudis and some Egyptians who are angry about America killing Iraqis from bases in Saudi Arabia and are angry about Israel killing Palestinians and Lebanese. And that's not any different. You don't have to believe in fundamentalist Islam to say, hey, those people are like me and I'm going to join in on their behalf. And we can see that's what terrorist recruitment is based on. And you know what? Here's how you can check my work. Look at 100% of the time that the FBI entrapped some idiot into a fake terrorist plot, okay? And you'll see two things: money, and secondly, and most importantly, don't you want to get revenge for what America is doing in XYZ? Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, whatever it is. That's what they tell them. That's what the FBI informant tells the mark. Hey, kid, say you love Osama into the microphone. Say it. Say you love Osama. And the kid goes, I don't know. And the guy goes, aren't you upset about what's happening to the poor people in Syria? And the kid goes, okay, I love Osama. And they go, gotcha. 100% of the time. They don't say, yeah, but the Hadith says that Christians are really, really bad and you're supposed to hate them for believing in Jesus. And so if you believe in that really, really hard and really, really radically, then you'll want to join our ridiculous terrorism plot against the local Christmas tree lighting, right? 100% of the time, 100% of the time, the FBI uses America's foreign policy to browbeat some idiot into agreeing to go along with his plot. In other words, Horton's right about everything. All this stuff about Islam was always, demonizing the other and using a cheap excuse. And of course, it's very convenient for the Israelis too, because the Americans hardly know that they're Palestinian Christians. Americans assume that all Arabs are Muslims. And guess who Israel wants to steal the West Bank from? A bunch of Arab Muslims. And so if they're all them, the other, the Arabs, the camel jockeys, the terrible, orcs from the East, the enemy civilization, that this world is just not big enough for us and them at the same time. And that happens to be all of Israel's enemies too. Well, isn't that convenient that Americans then have even that much less sympathy for the Palestinians' position? When in fact, again, the reason America and Israel have terrorist enemies in common is because of American support for Israel. It's not because Islam makes Muslims hate Israelis and Americans. It's because of what America is helping Israel do to these people. That's what it's all about. And again, just like in the clean break. Why? So they don't just have to give up the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. You'll hear pro-Israel hawks say till the cows come home, man, all day long and all night long. They'll say, but the UN General Assembly recommended that Israel get to create Israel in Palestine. Okay. Well, it also recommended that the Palestinians get their state too. What about that? No, Golda Meir made a secret trip to Jordan to make a deal with the king to stab the Palestinians in the back. So the king of Jordan would get the West Bank, and later, of course, Egypt took control of the Gaza Strip, just so that the Palestinians could not have their state, even on the measly stinking 22% of what was left of historic Palestine, which originally they were supposed to get 37 or something, even though they already owned about 90% of the land at the time of the declaration anyway. And of course, you notice the Israel hawks never will invoke any more UN resolutions of any kind whatsoever, because they all say, Israel, get out of the occupied territories. You have no right to steal them. So the UN Security Council resolution, that doesn't mean anything. A General Assembly recommendation? Well, that's the word of Yahweh. You know, this bunch of crap. Always with the Zionists, a bunch of crap for their excuses for stealing and killing.
Yeah, I mean, going back to what you said there, I mean, it's in popular culture, society, films that, you know, the terrorists did this because they hate our freedoms, they hate our way of life. And maybe Muslims and most of the Western world, or Muslims from the East, we may not have the same outlook on life, but that's definitely not why they do these terrorist attacks. You hear it, as you said, you know, the Boston Marathon bomber and other similar kind of attacks, they always cite the Middle Eastern wars and other things like that. And that doesn't mean it justifies it, but that's the reason they're giving, and that's what motivates them and radicalizes them along with all the other stuff. And another thing kind of tied in with this is obviously the refugee crisis, especially from Syria. And, you know, I'm not a person who just wants to take in every single, you know, immigrant and every single person. You need to obviously, you know who they are. And, you know, that's just not a plausible possibility. But these people never seem to understand that these refugee crises, the people coming over, is normally in relation to, you know, maybe sanctions or foreign policy, the war on terror. I mean, I looked at the other day, Germany has 850,000 Syrians there. You know, this is where they're coming from. And it's not always that. In the UK, you have Albanians and other things like that. It's not always foreign policy. It can be other factors, financial incentives to sit on the welfare state, whatever it may be. But why can't people make the connection with foreign policy, specifically the war on terror? If you really don't want these people here and you don't think Muslims can get on in our society, then stop radicalizing them by bombing their country and making them leave them. Why can't people make this connection?
No, I think they can. More and more, I think this is probably a big part of why the right wing has turned against the wars in the United States, and why you have a huge reaction to the right in Europe as well. And, you know, right wingers like being tough guys. They like being macho, and they like supporting blowing up things. Don't anybody mess with us, we'll bomb you, you know. But there comes a point where, man, this isn't working. And you don't have to have a PhD from Georgetown to go, wait a minute. Did you just say that all the refugees are from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen? Because that sounds familiar somehow, right? What do these countries have in common? America, mostly with European support, has bombed the crap out of them for the last 20 years. What are these Afghans doing in Germany? There was an Afghan kid who took a hatchet in the name of ISIS and chopped up a bunch of people on a train, and then jumped off the train, I think killed one more. And he said, look, you know what happened? You guys bombed my best friend back home in Helmand province. And so everyone said this kid had been getting along real well, and he had really liked it in Germany. He was really happy to be there and had been trying very hard to fit in as best as he could. But then Barack Obama killed his best friend back home in a drone strike. So he took a hatchet and he went on a train and he started hacking up a bunch of people. So one, this kid shouldn't have been there in the first place, but Barack Obama tore his country to shreds. Then he was trying to get along. He didn't turn to radical Islam. He didn't become a Salafi. He was from Afghanistan. He never heard of Salafism before. That's some weird Saudi thing, man. He's not on that. He was upset because they killed his buddy Brian back at the ranch, man. Just the same as you would feel. This is all it was. Just as God, think about how many people the Americans killed in revenge for one big attack on us on one day. So how could they possibly feel about what we've been doing to them for 20 years in a row? I mean, we've been bombing the crap out of them. Look, as you know about me, I think I mentioned it earlier completely in some weird context. I'm not over the Waco massacre from 30 years ago. And those are my own security forces that did that. That wasn't a foreign enemy that bombed those people in Texas. That was the cops that did that. And they should have, woulda, coulda. The system exists for them to be held accountable under the law here in my state. That's how that's supposed to work. None of them should have, all of them should be arrested peacefully and taken away to jail, the people who did that. But well, I'll never get over as long as I live. And I speak for a lot of other people too. And that was 80 people on one day. Now imagine, seriously.
Yeah.
Imagine if that had been a foreign enemy that had done that. And then that had been a foreign enemy that did that over and over and over and over and over again. Think about the war in Afghanistan from their point of view. Getting bombed and bombed and bombed for 20 years, man. For 20 years. And Afghanistan's about the size of Texas. So there's your rough analogy. A foreign nation bombing Texas, my home state, for 20 years. We're lucky how well they're able to forgive and forget compared to, imagine the vengeance of Texans subjected to that. Would make Al-Qaeda look like nothing. You know, it's completely crazy. As Ron Paul said, if we think we can just go around the world and bomb these people and kill these people this way and think that we're not putting ourselves at risk, then we do that at our own peril. And he would use the royal we because he was a government official in the Congress. So I wish he would say you more, right, when he was back in the Congress, because it wasn't really we, it wasn't him, and it wasn't us, but it was them, the government, that were putting us in this position. And yeah, then that is at our peril. That you know, they put us at risk, as you say, not just September 11th and all those attacks before I named in the 90s, but all the blowback attacks. Zazi, who had the plot to blow up the subway in New York, and I mentioned the entrapments. There are a lot of fake ones, but there are some that are not fake. The San Bernardino attack, that wasn't some FBI put on. The Omar Mateen attack at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, that wasn't some FBI entrapment job. These are terrorists who decided to do these, what they call lone wolf attacks. They nominally declared their loyalty to ISIS, you know, to do so for the publicity. And then they went and massacred innocent civilians. And they did so in, you know, what I call backdraft attacks. If blowback is the long-term consequences of secret foreign policies, this is the short-term consequences, blowing up right in your face for policies we can all see right in front of our eyes. Barack Obama built a caliphate, and then he bombed it to smithereens, killing hundreds of thousands of people. Hundreds of thousands. Man, there's going to be consequences for that. And it turns out, by the way, for people listening to this who don't know this, this is not specialized knowledge. A lot of people know this, but I guess a lot of people don't. The entire story that Omar Mateen was a repressed homosexual who hated gay people and wanted to go and execute those people. He'd been to that club a few times, and now he was like exercising his demons by doing this because radical Islam made him hate himself for being how gay he was and all this. All that was an absolute lie. Do you know that? There wasn't the slightest kernel of truth to it. None, ever. It was completely made up. Completely made up. His wife, they tried to prosecute her, and all this came out during her testimony at her trial. Their narrative was completely blown up. The only reason he chose that nightclub is because it was the first thing in the Google results when he searched nightclub in Orlando after he had decided that security at Disneyland was too tight. And so he went, or Disney World, pardon me. And so he went there. And then one of the first things he said was, where are all the girls? So he didn't understand that he was even at a gay club. The whole story about, oh, he was a repressed homosexual, all that was completely made up. What was the real story? The real story was he wrote on his Facebook page and he called 911. And it was all about America under Barack Obama bombing the caliphate that he had built in Syria, as well as bombing the, you know, the trailing end of the surge escalation in the war in Afghanistan. And the guy, I'm not, just as you said, this isn't a justification at all. It's just for people to understand the reality of the world that they're living in. This guy Mateen, like, they didn't release the audio, but if you can intuit anything from the transcript, he's absolutely beside himself. He's completely in a rage, and he's repeating himself over and over and over. You have to stop the bombing. You're killing women and children. You're killing women and children. You have to stop. Do you hear me? You have to stop. That's why I'm doing this. And he's going off. It's the same thing as bin Laden's, declaration of war against the Americans occupying the land of the two holy places. It's the same thing as Ramzi Youssef's letters to the New York newspapers after the first World Trade Center bombing. It's the same thing over and over and over again. Stop killing my people. What would Americans do in the same situation? Kill people. Again, look at what we've done. We can't stand it when they resist our oppression. Imagine if we were really the ones who were oppressed, what we would do. So, Again, it's not to excuse it. When bin Laden said in his letter to America that you voted wrong and I get to kill you now, he was essentially adopting the same morality as Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright, who said, not even that you voted wrong, but that you have failed to kill Saddam Hussein for us, not that you have the ability to do so. But since you are collectively guilty of being Iraqi and not having successfully overthrown your government, and so it's your life is fair game, we can kill you all we want. That's what Madeleine Albright and Bill Clinton said. So bin Laden was just as evil and wrong and murderous and criminal as them, to adopt that same morality and say that now the lives of your civilians are fair game as well. And then that means that Bush and Obama and all of their men who've done what they have done in the meantime were just as wrong as well. That no, somebody does something to you doesn't give you the right to kill civilians. And I couldn't find this quote because I thought it was Nixon, but I guess it was Kissinger. And I need to nail the quote down. I'm sure people can find this. It's one of the two. But I guess I was corrected. Somebody told me it's a Kissinger quote, and it's from one of his memoirs, his books. I think he wrote a lot of books. But there's one where I think they're talking about Vietnam. And he's saying, listen, you got to understand that when you're a statesman, there's just this whole other separate level of morality where killing civilians in the other guy's country doesn't mean anything. That's his problem. You're dealing now, he doesn't say Mount Olympus, but that's basically the idea, right? You're now dealing with gods and demigods, and they deal with affairs of state here. And suffering by regular schmucks down there, that's not for them to worry about. That's for the leader on the other side to worry about his own people. But it is never our concern. And you can even hear in the audio tapes of Nixon and Kissinger, where Nixon is drunk and he's saying, why don't we just nuke them, Henry? Why don't we just bomb all the dikes and flood them out and kill them all? And Kissinger says, well, sir, my concern is that you would be seen as a butcher and world opinion would not stand for it. But he doesn't say, for Christ's sakes, Mr. President, you can't just drop atom bombs on human beings, man. You can't just bomb the dikes and flood the people? You're going to drown a little baby because you're drunk and mad? What are you talking about, dude? You can't drown people's babies. But if you're Nixon and Kissinger, you can. And the only reason that you might not to would be, oh, geez, what if the French get really upset or something? It wouldn't be the French upset. I don't know who they'd be worried about in that case. I guess the French would be happy about it. But that's how they think. Look at what Israel's doing in Palestine right now. Did you read the article in 972 about the assassination complex? Okay, check this out, man. You guys all have to read this, okay? This is your homework assignment. It's so important. It's called A Mass Assassination Factory Inside Israel's Calculated Bombing of Gaza. A Mass Assassination Factory. It's in 972 mag. Solid journalism based on high-level Israeli sources throughout. It's about they're deliberately killing kids. They are deliberately killing civilians. As in their own words, they all but use the T word itself, terrorism, to terrorize the people of Gaza into putting pressure on Hamas into what? Giving up or some stupid thing that makes no sense. And they admit toward the end of the article, they quote one of the officials admitting that, of course, yeah, the more we bomb them, the more credibility Hamas has. This doesn't work. It achieves the exact opposite. Just the same way as when Al-Qaeda attacks America, it makes everybody support W. Bush, although they were trying to get us to do that, trying to get us to go nuts, just as Hamas was trying to get Israel to do this. But the pro-empire side, they never realize how they're playing into their enemy's hands and what they're doing, in responding to the reactions the way that they do. Although, I don't know, the Israelis might just take such advantage of this that they just get away with it anyway and just take the whole strip. I was just reading an article in the Post about how they've dropped so many bombs on the strip now that with the error rate, that means they're undetonated bombs. They're duds all over Gaza that make it, in their words, unlivable. Just another reason you can't come home. Sorry. Your whole territory is littered with these duds here. And looks like they're going to try to cleanse the whole damn strip now. So, but we'll see what's the reaction from that. I'm telling you what, man, we're getting near a point where these kooks are going to blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque and try to rebuild the third temple and start sacrificing animals full time there. And that's going to cause a war, dude. That's going to cause the whole world order to shift. In terms of, every Muslim fighter from the Philippines to Nigeria is going to go to war over that, man. And what are we going to do then? And who knows what's going to happen in Europe and the United States and all of that. Mm-hmm. And this is just not within America, or for that matter, Britain's national interest to be supporting this stuff. You would think, I don't know, man. They spend so much time, don't they, on this public relations about caring about civilian lives and the rule of law and all this. It's almost unbelievable when you see it before their eyes, where the Israelis are like, look, we're not focusing on precision, okay? We don't care about that. Yeah, we know there are children in that house. We don't care about that. They compare it to, what if when IDF soldiers go home for the weekend, then the terrorists bomb their house on a Saturday when they're at home with their wife and kids? Like, that's the equivalent here. They're following these guys home and taking out their entire extended family with them. And they don't give a shit. They don't care at all. They do it over and over again. And then a lot of times they even admit that they know that people aren't there. Call them power targets. We're going to bring down this high rise full of civilians because we think it'll make people mad at Hamas, instead of just more mad at them and more reliant on Hamas to resist them. It's so ugly, man. It's unbelievable.
You give me almost an hour and a half. So do you need to jump off soon? I was just going to ask you another question, but if you need to go.
Yeah, let's do one more and then I do.
Okay, so obviously kind of in the theme of what we've been speaking about recently with kind of people's perceptions about religion, Muslims, people with this conflict in Israel and Palestine can't separate it being Muslims versus Jews, or as the Christian Western world needs to support the Judaism and democracy and liberalism. Is this Israeli-Palestine conflict about religion, or is it just about these people wanting their land back? If you take away the Jewish part of Israel, it's just them taking this land. Do you think it is a religious conflict? Obviously, Muslims will feel favor towards Palestine, but you have, countries in South America who are Christian and Catholic who don't back Israel because they see it as a colonial struggle similar to themselves with, the American empire and everything they do. So, is this a religious struggle?
Yes and no, and all of those things are right. It's a big mix. You have, the Zionist project was originally created by a bunch of atheists who had no interest in God or any of that at all, saw themselves as a separate ethnicity and had this, nationalist project essentially. But it is, an ethno-religious nationalist kind of a mix. And the parties in power in Israel include a lot of absolute religious kooks, fundamentalist nuts who, yes, some of them would very much like to genetically engineer a pure red heifer as the excuse to then blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque and start sacrificing animals and force the Messiah to come back, or some crazy kind of nutball stuff. There is a lot of that. And I think a lot of this is cynical, but a lot of it kind of, it does attitude follows behavior in a way. So, when I was younger, I was under the impression that the argument over there was, well, God gave us this land. No, God gave us this land. No, God gave us this land. So to me, it's irrational and unsolvable. And so it's never going to be solved. And so who cares? Like, let it be somebody else's problem. I don't know. But that's such a smokescreen, right? That's not really true. The Palestinians are saying, hey, we're from here. And the Israelis are saying, hey, we might not be from here, but our religion says that we have now this supernatural property right that overrides your property right, because 2,000 years ago, my great-grandmother to the 10th power may have been from here, or may have been converted at some point to the same religion as people who were from here. And so now we got the right, the supernatural right that overrides your natural property right. So my grandfather gave me this land. No, God gave us this land. That's the argument. And you can see how the latter argument there is complete hogwash. It's ridiculous mythology. It's stupid, childish, superstitious garbage. And no other society anywhere in the world has the right to go back to where their ancestors were from and invade the place and kill people and take it over. Imagine the Italians of New York and New Jersey going back to southern Italy and killing everybody and taking it and saying, this is where our ancestors are from. Or I got one for you, Mr. Englishman. How about if the Germans tried to go and take back the ancient origins of the Teuton race over there on the border of East Prussia and Poland? What might Britain do about that? Go to war against them maybe for daring to try it? You think that you got Lebensraum and you can go and conquer the area where your forefathers were from? No, you can't. That's against the law. We'll bomb you, they said. You know, no one in the world could do that. And it would have made sense maybe, not that it would have worked, but it would have made sense for a bunch of Eastern European Jews maybe to try to make a nation in the ashes of the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to somehow carve out a little piece of part of Poland and Lithuania and Ukraine and Belarus and somewhere in there, right around in there, carve out a little piece of something and call it, you know, Eastern European Jewistan or something, maybe. I don't know. Like would have made some sense, but instead the project was, we got to go all the way to Palestine, and which was only moderately successful until after the Second World War. And then so many of the refugees from the Second World War went and really made it possible for them to have the numbers to try to create a state at that point, although they were still like the severe minority. But, you know, look, I'm a pretty secular guy, and I tend to look at religious excuses as mostly excuses and smoke screens for, you know, I consider most clergy to be politicians, quite frankly, and I don't take what they say to be, you know, very serious. I tend to look at it mostly as excuses for wealth and money and power, control over land, and the rest of things like that. But it's not right that people don't really believe in their religions, because, yeah, they do too, and they can be very powerful. And when it comes especially to writing you a license to get away with what otherwise would be wrong, it says here that Israel's borders one day have to stretch all the way to Turkey. No more Lebanon. No more at least part of Syria. Those people are all going to have to go someday. And by the way, we get all the land all the way down the western coast of the Red Sea. You think that's Egypt? Nope, that's Greater Israel, buddy. It's just waiting to be further colonized. And same thing for not just Jordan, but all of western Iraq to the Euphrates River, all the way down to Kuwait. And you know what? Maybe just all the way to Persia, depending on how you interpret that thing. I think God might have promised us all the land all the way to Iran. That is, depending on who you ask, the borders of Greater Israel. And so someday the American people are going to help make that a reality for them with all our money and all our bombs. They think, or they want, you know, certainly the right-wing parties there are intent on stealing all of the West Bank and someday moving all the Palestinians out of there. And it's just completely nuts. And I think as soon as people realize who's occupying who over there, who's the underdog and who's the oppressor, their point of view just clears right up. I mean, almost everyone in the United States, in my experience, is just completely confused about this. People go, how could you possibly take the Palestinian side? And then you go, well, because they were beaten, completely licked and conquered 60 years ago. And they've been under foreign military martial law ever since then. And their lives suck, man. They're some of the most oppressed people in the world. That's why. Then they go, oh, I didn't know that. Because they didn't know that. In fact, polls say a lot of Americans think that the Palestinians are occupying Israel. Because the TV and the government, they just lie. They're just bought and paid for. And the way that they spin it, the Israelis are the ones always defending themselves. I don't know if you saw that comedian, I don't know much about him, but Bassem Youssef or something like that, said to Piers Morgan, he goes, yeah, you know, it's really a strange situation where the oppressed are able to carpet bomb their oppressors from the air, and the oppressors are unable to do anything about it. You know, one side is a first world nation state. The other side is a conquered Indian reservation being just punished and abused and murdered. And as soon as people understand that, as soon as they understand, oh, Ben Shapiro is a liar. Ben Shapiro always uses these analogies to confuse you, not to enlighten you. He says, what would we do if Mexico attacked us? Okay, Mexico's a nation state. So that's not the question at all, stupid, at all. The question is, what would we do if some Indians broke out of the reservation and committed an atrocity? And the answer is not, we would massacre 15,000 Navajo or whoever on the res in retribution. Not anymore, maybe in the 19th century. But, you know, even Second Wounded Knee was what, like dozens of people. What's happening here is an absolute atrocity. Anyone with eyes to see and an honest conscience could tell you. As Bill Hicks, the great comedian, said, in your heart, you all know the arguments. You don't have to be convinced of this. Just look and stop lying to yourself.
Yeah, I think the way you describe it with the Native Americans is obviously a good one, because part of the argument, obviously, with Israel and Palestine was that the Jews used to be there, over 1,000 years ago. Whether you want to say the Native Americans were in America just a few centuries ago, and if they did get enough, power and funding or whatever, and they did start massacring, Americans and try and take back the land, people wouldn't be, they'd be like, we're sorry that we took it from you, but it's too late. That wouldn't be a plausible argument. So I think it's definitely an interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah, and look, well, first of all, that's right. We would say, sorry, too late for that. But you notice America doesn't continually beat up on the Indians the way that the Israelis pick on the Palestinians at all. And if we did, we would have fundamentalist, cloud worshipers, killing us in retribution. And at some point, the fighting has got to die down here. And, and think of the absurdity of any Jew anywhere in the world has the right to quote unquote, because it's complete BS, quote unquote, return to Israel, when actual Palestinians who are actually from there have no right to return whatsoever. And they call it, the right of return. It's supposed to sound insane to you. The refugees' right to return. Oh my God, never. Why? Well, that would destroy the Jewish super duper 80-20% majority in Israel. It's the same reason they can't just give citizenship to the Israelis. I mean, if Israel wants to steal the West Bank and Gaza Strip so bad, why not give citizenship to the Palestinians on the West Bank and in Gaza and just say, okay, well, all this territory belongs to Israel and you're all Israeli citizens now. Well, they can't do that. Not because they're all a bunch of wild beasts who are going to kill every Jew and push them into the sea, but because they would have a vote in the parliament. They would get to vote for members of the Knesset and would have representation. And that would ruin the 80-20 super duper Jewish majority to rule in a so-called Jewish democracy. And people talk about these Palestinians like they're all a bunch of beasts. As Jefferson said about the slaves, we have the wolf by the ear. We can neither safely hold him nor let him go. But the thing is, first of all, he's not a wolf. He's a human man. You got no right to hold him, stupid. And that goes for Jefferson and it goes for the Israelis on the issue of the Palestinians here. But two, they're not wolves even in the figurative sense. They're not all a bunch of dangerous animals. They're just human beings. this made-up conception about the bestial nature of the Palestinians. But dude, just look at the fact, 20% of the population of Israel are Palestinians, are Arab, Muslims, and Christians. They're not at war. They're not terrorists. They're not monsters and beast men. They're just regular people. It's the same thing for the Palestinians penned in the West Bank and Gaza Strip camps. It's just that if they were allowed out, that would dilute the power of the Jewish majority. So they could rule with an iron fist and call it the Jewish apartheid state, or they could call it a multi-ethnic democracy, but no longer the Jewish state. Or, in fact, they could be creative and try it if they had any goodwill at all. You could have a binational state where the Palestinians and the Israelis have their own local security forces, but otherwise live in one country together. And the Israelis can have their weird little theocracy, and it could not apply to the Palestinians. They would have their own separate rules and all that kind of thing. And they're binational states and trinational states and what have you all over the world. I mean, the way America works, and we have our little ethnic enclaves, but people are just mixed together all around anyway, especially in big cities and that kind of thing. It's very different for us here. But in the rest of the world, you know, people are very ethnically divided by region usually, and there's some separation, but usually you have pretty homogeneous groups here and there, but the borders are never drawn around them, right, in the quote unquote right places. People are always mixed together, and I don't mean that right by my morality, but I'm saying you have minority ethnic and religious groups stuck with majorities that they didn't pick, but who rule over them anyway, and yet somehow they get along. They figure out how to not stay at war with each other forever. The answer, of course, is liberty, right? And if the minority in your state is not oppressed, then there's nothing to fight about. If they're not allowed to speak their language and they're not allowed to practice their religious beliefs and those kinds of things, then you're going to have a real problem. But if people respect each other, they can live together. And the reality is, you know, remember, you know, when you're like in 5th grade or 6th grade or whatever, and you kind of learn history, it all just seems so inevitable. Well, this happened, and then this happened. This caused First World War, and then this caused the second one, and then we went to Vietnam and whatever. I know Vietnam's not your war, but anyway, like you get the point. It all seems like, well, yeah, I mean, these were the decisions the adults were making with the best information at the time, and this was, you know, it all kind of seems like it had to be. You grow up a little bit and you realize that, no, that really isn't right. Things could have just as easily gone the other way. Like in Iraq War I, George Bush didn't care that Iraq invaded Kuwait. He didn't give a damn about that. And I don't know that he told James Baker, but he must have known. James Baker told Saddam Hussein, go ahead and break their knees. See if we give a shit, man. Those Kuwaitis are giving you trouble. Go ahead and hit them, Saddam. Bush wasn't going to do anything about it until Margaret Thatcher called him a wimp on TV. She said, don't you go all wobbly on me now, Bush. Well, she was a she and he was a he. And he was the ruler of the world empire and she was the ruler of the has-been empire. And he had to be tougher than her. And that was it. August the 3rd, Maggie used the magic word wobbly, and George H.W. Bush became her slave. And America went to war with Iraq and kicked all this over. But he could have said, you know what? You got bad breath, lady. And that would have been the end of that. He didn't have to do that, but he did. And it just goes to show the same thing with the Israelis here. If that Netanyahu devotee had not murdered Yitzhak Rabin, we'd be living in a different world. Or if Bill Clinton didn't put this absurd, 5-day limit? Or was it 2-week limit on the negotiations at Camp David in 2000? I got to get on a plane. I think it was 5 days. I got to get on a plane in 5 days. Hammer it out, everybody. He just blew up the whole damn thing, Bill. And then they just blame it all on Arafat. He's an Arab. It was his fault. We tried to give him everything and he wouldn't accept it. Could you believe it? No. Bill Clinton, the lying murderer, butcher of Waco, lied is what he did. He botched those negotiations and he lied because he's a goddamn liar. It's like on everything. Bill Clinton's a liar. That's what happened at Camp David. But it didn't have to be that way. He could have said, now listen, Barack, and listen, Arafat, we're going to hammer this thing out, man. And if my staff made a mistake on that piece of paper, we're going to fix it right now. He didn't do that. He didn't handle it. He put Dennis Ross, they called him Israel's lawyer, in charge of the negotiations. The Israelis complained. Man, the American is too loyal to our side. It ruins our whole ability to negotiate. We wish we had a more neutral partner to host the negotiations. This guy is too in the tank for us. They complained, man. In other words, it never had to be this way. It's just that stupid, horrible people made stupid, horrible decisions that they didn't have to do. They could have figured out how to give the Palestinians a state a long time ago. And they could have figured out how to create a binational state where people can get along. But instead, they had men of bad faith, like Ariel Sharon and Benjamin Netanyahu, making the decisions instead. Even Ehud Olmert, if he had stayed around, he might have been able to hammer something out, although I don't know if he had really the power inside Israel to do it. He might have had the intention to finally be fair. He was certainly less of a kook and an ideologue compared to Sharon and Netanyahu, who are both extremely hard men on this stuff. But it didn't have to be this way at all. And you know, like if Ariel Sharon hadn't gone to the Temple Mount in 2000 and caused the second Intifada to kick off, then Barack might have won that election and been able to stay and finish the negotiation at Taba at the end of 2000 and into 2001. But then you got W. Bush and Dick Cheney came to town anyway. So, but anyway, I mean, Colin Powell wanted to do a Palestinian state. If Bill Clinton had been really on track in 2000, maybe Powell could have finished up in early 01. Anyway, just point being that, you know, it's not a great man theory of history. It's just an individualist theory of history, right? There's, unlike the Marxists who see all this as like the inevitable winds of time blowing and tides of history, you know, coming in and all this stuff. I don't. I just think everything could have been completely different. If only one thing had gone a little bit different way, we could have had America firsters in charge who were determined to bring the empire home. As I said, even that SOB Bill Clinton thought it just made sense to normalize relations with Iraq and Iran. We can offshore balance from an aircraft carrier in the Gulf. Why do we need to stay in bases in Saudi? It was only because Israel insisted. But he could have told them no and just figured out something else. Rabin wasn't that hard of a hard ass by then. He was an old man. They could have, Bill Clinton was the boss. He could have resisted, but instead he went along and made the absolutely horrible and fateful decision to keep the troops in Saudi that whole decade long when he didn't have to do that. So you see what I mean? Same thing like with Waco. These guys decided, well, the gas canister tanks are ready, so let's go. But they didn't have to do that. They could have said, you know what, the negotiations have been going really well. We're going to give them 2 more days. But they just didn't. Some guy, that would be Jeff Jamar, Jamar, decided, nope, let's kill him. And so they killed him. But it didn't have to be Jeff Jamar. Bill Clinton could have pulled Jeff Jamar out of there 3 weeks ago. Jeff, you seem stressed out. Hit the bench, hit the showers, kid. Go on vacation. We're going to bring in a new special agent in charge from somewhere else. Anyway, all these things are up to people to just do the right thing if they want to, you know, or at least choose the least worst option when they have them.
Yeah, I would agree. History isn't that simple that, you know, just everything falls into place and then it had to happen. There's decisions that have to be made, just like, you know, kind of through the Cold War. You know, we've came through that with no one being nuked, as in either side. So there's probably one of those times where it could have been. I know you've written a book about it, collected information for a book, Hotter Than the Sun, which I'll put up on the screen. Still need to read that myself. So that's an example of it could have gone the other way. It didn't. So there are some people who step in and be like, nah, that is just too crazy or too bad for PR from what you referred earlier. But you've given me lots and lots of time here. Appreciate that. So I will let you jump off. I'll point everyone to obviously antiwar.com, the Libertarian Institute. I'll link it all up. Some of the articles you referenced. I'll link up your article with Connor Freeman about Netanyahu's support for Hamas, you know, from the horse's mouth again. But yeah, thank you for coming on. I'll link up all your books, everything I can. But yeah, really appreciate you coming on and giving me so much time. I'll let you get on because you're one of the busiest people probably on the planet. So keep up the good work. And yeah, just thank you for coming on.
Absolutely. Happy to do it anytime. And just one more thing, I would ask your audience if you like what you hear here. It is our, that's two different spellings of the word here in a row. That was kind of funny. It's our fund drive time right now at the Libertarian Institute, if people are interested in supporting that. And check out my show, The Scott Horton Show. I got 6,000 interviews, almost 6,000 interviews going back to 2003, all at scotthorton.org.
Oh, yeah, one actually tiny last question. When you did that interview the other day for Star Wars for a few hours, was you literally just talking about Star Wars the whole time, or did you end up, you know, correlating it with the US empire or anything? Or was it literally just pure Star Wars for like 3 hours?
Oh, yeah. No, there's discussion of what it all was about. I mean, the story of Star Wars is about the American empire in the first place. It was supposed to be an allegory about our society. So yeah, there's a lot of talk in there. It was basically a Thanksgiving episode of my friend Alan Mosley's show. It's called It's Too Late. That's his nighttime show. And we just sat around and BS'd about Star Wars for a little while. It may be TMI for people, you know, as they say, but yeah, it is. It's me talking about Star Wars for like 2 hours, 2.5 hours or something, I think.
All right. Well, yeah, thank you for coming on again. And yeah, just really appreciate your work and your books and everything. But yeah, thank you for giving your time.
Absolutely. You're welcome, and thank you.